It is over 32 months into Russia's war with Ukraine, and today we also want to review the military situation there. I'm Julian Rupke, and this is BILD Situation Room. We begin our broadcast for the first time at the Caspian Sea in the Russian region of Dagestan. Today, for the first time, the Ukrainian army managed to attack a Russian warship in the Caspian Sea with a drone. We are reviewing the footage from earlier this morning, and they are indeed quite extraordinary because we see the recordings from the Russian location, specifically the Russian Caspian flotilla, namely Kaspisk. And Kaspisk is, as mentioned, in the region of Dagestan near Makhachkala, which is the capital of this region. Roughly around 800 kilometers distant from Ukraine, but specifically from the Ukrainian border, not the present front line. And what we observe back there is an airplane, a type of aircraft, perhaps a drone, a flying object that is approaching both the camera and moving towards the harbor. And we can already see that this, I'll try to mark it here, that this object is going into a dive and now heading over the sea towards these warships that are anchored here at the front, just now flying. We are now witnessing the final approach of this aircraft, and we are now seeing a massive explosion here in one of the ships. We can take a look at this once more because it is truly a first occurrence, something unprecedented happening for the first time. That Ukraine has seemingly constructed an aircraft, a type of drone. There are now images showing that the whole thing looks more like an ultralight aircraft than a classic drone. So it's about 5 meters long and has a wingspan of approximately 8 meters. With this aircraft, there's currently a well-coordinated and strategic assault taking place on a Russian missile ship, which is presently anchored at the port of Kaspisk. And we'll also look at the whole thing on the map to see what Ukraine has achieved here and that it's something that hasn't been there before. Because Kaspisk, as we can observe here, is situated nearby, as previously mentioned, close to Azerbaijan, near Georgia, right here by the Caspian Sea. And we are aware that Russia launches quite a number of its cruise missiles, such as its Caliber ones, from this flotilla also in the Caspian Sea. Actually, Russia should be defending itself to the south towards Iran and so on, but these weapon systems and ships are also being used to attack Ukraine, and therefore it's certainly a legitimate target for Ukrainian defense. And if we now look at the range, the distance this plane must have covered to reach Kaspisk, that's up to the front, and you can't start directly behind it, but probably in Zaporizhia or a similar location, so it's approximately 1,200 kilometers. The aircraft must have traveled in order to finally reach the Caspian Sea and encounter the Russian flotilla in that region for the very first time since the war started back in February 22. So it is a noteworthy success for Ukraine, perhaps not entirely coincidental on the election day in the USA to make a statement. Even we, without your continuous support and without your authorization to utilize long-range weapons of Western origin, are indeed quite capable. 1,000 kilometers, even 1,200 kilometers away from the front to strike and attack Russia in the hinterland where no one would have expected it. We move a bit further west in Russia into the Kursk region. And there, since the 6th of August, the Ukrainian offensive was going on and couldn't be effectively repelled by the Russian army. And we have new footage showing us that Russia continues to suffer heavy losses in Kursk. We see footage of Ukrainian kamikaze drones. The entire connection roads, that is the supply roads to this small part, are still about 700 square kilometers, over which Ukraine consistently maintains control within Russian territory. And these essential and strategic supply routes are frequently utilized by Russian vehicles. We can see from these vehicles here, Russia isn't placing much focus on this region. So there are hardly any tanks or armored personnel carriers here. Instead, you have a civilian vehicle, a small loader, or something similar, which is used here to supply the troops. And this, we can of course see it with the Zed here as well, that it is of course a military target. The Zed is obviously not supposed to show the Ukrainians, I'm military. It's intended as a clear signal to Russian civilians and checkpoint officials that this vehicle is fully allowed to pass through the area without undergoing any inspection. And as a result, it's considerably simpler for the Ukrainians because they can fairly easily identify military targets even on civilian vehicles. We see more trucks, that's a Ural being attacked here, and we see how Ukraine is proceeding very systematically with all these partially civilian vehicles while they are on their way into Kursk, and as they exit it, relentlessly attacking these over and over again. And it genuinely hurts the Russians a great deal, as you can visibly see from their success or failure outcomes in Kursk. They still haven't succeeded, while we can see here that a Ural truck has been taken out of service. Here, there's another fire burning at a location. The Russian forces have not been able to successfully recapture the area of Kursk in more than 3 months. We are closely observing the various Russian activities in the region of Kursk and have noticed that fiber optic guided kamikaze drones play an increasingly essential role for the strategic operations of the Russian army in these recent days. We have witnessed another attack on an already deserted and abandoned Ukrainian Cossack vehicle that is currently stationed here. However, there are no Ukrainian soldiers involved anymore, and we can clearly see that in previous attacks, either with mines or something else, this drone shield, which was originally draped over the vehicle, is already off. Thus, there's no defense left now. The door at the back was left open. In this regard, the fiber optic control now allows the Russians, relatively simple here, to penetrate this vehicle within a meter or even within half a meter and then detonate the drone directly inside this empty vehicle. That's been happening more and more lately, and for the first time, which is quite interesting, we now have a view from above. That means the Russians filmed themselves during this attack. We can see quite clearly in these recordings that the 4 propellers of the drone, this quadcopter, are connected. I'll attempt to sketch it out so that we have a kind of square, which I'll be using here with the grenade in front, and also a spool with this long fiber optic cable attached moving towards the vehicle. We spoke with Ukrainian drone experts once again yesterday and inquired why they haven't been using these fiber optic drones, which are supposedly, as the Russians at least show, is how successful they are. And one argument was the significantly shorter range. Theoretically, there have already been tests with 8-kilometer-long fiber optic cables. However, the Ukrainians and drone experts tell us that in reality, such a fiber optic cable here is only a few kilometers long, about 4 or 5 kilometers. And that means we have relatively limited range and a relatively high risk for the operators, meaning the pilots of these drones who always have to be deployed and need to get relatively close to the front to bring the drones to the target. The Ukrainians continue to say even if we have a higher likelihood that through jamming, that is through electronic warfare, our radio signal guided drones will not hit their targets. With the 10, 15 and sometimes 20 kilometers of range, we have a significant advantage and continue using our radio-controlled drones. We just saw it. They can also very, very precisely target moving vehicles as long as there's no Russian electronic warfare. And the Russians, in contrast, in Kursk, concentrate quite heavily on those particular drones that have a fiber optic cable connected at the back. We want to examine the entire situation on the map and observe that Russia even now is unable to retake Kursk. Let's take another look at it and compare a bit what Ukraine had, what they had in mid-August and what they still have now. And that's actually still almost the same area. We'll look at it again. They had advanced nearly as far as Koronevo up here, reached the same river and then continued downwards from there. This means that Russia was able to recapture this area in more than 3 months. The rest is still under Ukrainian control, which shows that Russia either has no interest or lacks the capability to advance here and reclaim its own territory, to gain control. Instead, as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky explained, North Korean troops have fought here for the first time yesterday. There are currently no pictures of this yet. However, it appears that Russia is instead relying on mercenaries originating from North Korea to attempt to retake Kursk or at the very least defend it. That's not entirely clear yet. The focus of the Russian army remains in Donetsk, in the eastern Ukrainian region of Donetsk. That is the location we intend to explore now and analyze new footage which illustrates how Russia is executing its strategy to advance even further, sometimes unsuccessful, yet at other times quite successful. We are looking at 2 scenes from the region of Kurakova, and we have the situation where about 250 square kilometers have been captured by the Russian army in the last 3 weeks. And we'll take a look at a frontal assault by the Russian army from Maximilianivka towards Kurakova. This is the first video we're watching. It goes roughly along here. They're trying to storm Kurakov head-on with many tanks, with many armored vehicles. And we are looking at another attack from a very small landing force here south of the small town of Konstantinopolske. And we immediately see that these 2 attacks unfold very differently, that they are also very different in terms of success. But the entire thing is part of the big picture to understand how Russia operates and how one still manages to advance further. We're first looking at the footage as mentioned from right at the eastern entrance of Kurakov. Russia is once again advancing using a massive tank deployment, with many armored vehicles moving closely together along the road, while mines are lying around on the outside. That's why you have to take the road. However, we can also see that Ukraine manages to stop all those vehicles there. So, absolutely, once again, it manages to stop the Russian vehicles deployed in that area, thereby forcing the troops to disembark. And here we can see the different perspectives, that when the first vehicle comes to a stop, it's relatively difficult for those behind to continue driving, or they must come to a complete halt and thereby become even easier targets for Ukraine. The video is edited so that we repeatedly see how the vehicles are attacked, and then after they have been immobilized, are attacked by Russian troops who are hiding in the forest to the left and right, hoping to somehow survive the day. For most of them, that plan fails. Instead, the majority of them die in this attack. Some hide until night and then head back to Maximilian-Nivka, which was very close, so that the next day, ideally for them, or in the worst case, as you prefer, to be moved to be redeployed to directly attack Kurakov. And at the end, it zooms out, showing this vast tank graveyard on the street here, which directly leads towards the town of Kurakov. I think we can just briefly mark it now. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 tanks that were taken out in this attack alone, and not a single one reached Kurakov. This means that this was a very unsuccessful attack by the Russian army and a very successful defense by the Ukrainians right in the vicinity of Kurakov. However, the problem is that the Russians are not only launching these major attacks on the main defense lines, but are also continuously probing for gaps in the Ukrainian defenses. That means if there's a rotation on the Ukrainian side when one unit leaves and another enters, or the Russians have discovered a very weak spot on the front due to airstrikes, that there might be several wounded there, or that the entire unit has completely left the forest. Then they resort to other methods to advance in that area, and they consistently manage to do so, to successfully flank the Ukrainians. We have the footage here, as I mentioned earlier, from the south, specifically from Konstantinopolsk, which we just observed. And there it is a single Russian infantry fighting vehicle advancing from the Russian position, which is the forest ridge already held by the Russians. We now see here how he fires, while moving forward, repeatedly fires at the Ukrainian position. And here we can see it quite well. So this is the Russian-maintained forest, and back there we have the next one, Ukrainian-held strip of forest, and that is precisely the goal of the Russians, who are advancing about 600 meters here. And because the Ukrainians had to retreat so quickly over the past weeks, there are no mines there yet. So that means there are no mines here. This gives the Russians the ability to choose their path quite freely. The Ukrainians can only intercept the whole thing with drones, for example, or by shooting back directly. Neither course of action happens in this situation, and the Russians proceed roughly these 500 meters. And we then arrive on the other side and attack the position that was still being held by the Ukrainians. I think it's quite clear here. You can see the sandbags lying there in the forest. That's the precise location where the armored vehicle fired, and it's exactly where the troops are currently being deployed. We don't know how the whole thing turned out, if the Russians, who are about to disembark from the armored vehicle, made it, or if they were killed. But we know from our map supplier, from Deep State Map, and they are activists who are very closely connected with the Ukrainian army, who can therefore observe everything very closely. Now we see how the Russians are being unloaded, indicating that this area is now also under Russian control. That means these two combined strategies, on one hand, the massive attacks that tie down the Ukrainians, sometimes resulting in hundreds of Russian deaths, and on the other hand, the flanking attacks from the south, in the case of Kurakov, eventually lead to a further and substantial Russian advantage in the overall ongoing scenario. Let's take another quick look at the map, because if the projection we just observed continues to advance, if that specific piece of forest we just took note of keeps moving forward, what is nearly exactly positioned here? If you do succeed in reaching Konstantinopolsk there, they are not labeled, but you might notice them when you look by the road. There are a total of 6 Ukrainian settlements that could no longer be supplied along this road, which are currently still held by the Ukrainian army. But the Russians are once more trying not to prevent every settlement, attack individually, but instead to try and flank them. The strategy involves going in one direction to effectively cut those off. The Ukrainians would then accordingly retreat there and, in a broader sense, even advance from Maximivka to here, towards Andriivka, in the hope that if they reach Andriivka, the Ukrainian army is withdrawing from Kurakova, even though this city is currently being defended very successfully. We just saw that the unit stationed there has a relatively easy time dealing with the Russian invasions. Finally, let's take a look at an additional flanking maneuver, because it is often the case. That the Russians open a southern flank for a frontal attack and also advance northwards here. So they're trying to advance along this reservoir towards Berezki. They aren't there yet, but if they manage to reach it, then you find yourself here. I'm thinking pretty well. There are several dams and bridges spanning this reservoir that are currently essential for the logistics. The Ukrainian army, why do we know this so precisely? We visited Kurakov and Berezki ourselves about 2 months ago. Back then, the front was still 8 kilometers further east. Now it is only a few hundred meters away. In that sense, it is indeed an extremely important logistics route stretching from Berezki to the south towards Kurakova, which the Russians are currently trying to cut off. This effective strategy of flanking, where advancing further with smaller units is undertaken to evade the main Ukrainian defense line, is what we also observe happening near Pokrovsk, even there. The Russians persist in their efforts by continuing to attack, and currently we are able to see something quite like what we have observed earlier. This means we have a Russian vehicle here, an infantry fighting vehicle, from the Russian-held position down here, which we'll see better soon. Just moving to the Ukrainian-held position up there, and there are two of them, two tanks that keep going back and forth. It's a kind of ferry that keeps transporting more and more Russian soldiers from one place to another, trying to bypass the Ukrainian defense at this location. The entire event is happening approximately around 4 kilometers to the northwest of Selidova. Selidova is another location, another large city that the Russians have captured in recent weeks, and they are trying to advance further along the railway line on the left side. The scenes are similar, as always, like before. It's a bit of déjà vu. Over there, by the way, we see a cemetery of a place. So the Russian vehicle drops off the soldiers there, then drives back, firing in the process. And now we can see it quite well. The first vehicle made it, unloaded the soldiers, and is driving back. And the second vehicle, much like a ferry service, is now heading over there and dropping off the next group of soldiers. And it all goes back and forth, and it looks relatively straightforward from the Russian side. And we see that the Ukrainians are indeed defending themselves. We just saw a shell impact, and we'll see shortly that we see it here repeatedly, that even multiple drones, kamikaze drones, hit the vehicles repeatedly. However, and this is part of the truth, it often requires not just one, but 2, 3, 4, or even 5 drones to effectively hit a well-armored infantry fighting vehicle that is equipped with additional protective nets and to immobilize it. Here, it doesn't work. In this Russian propaganda video, it might succeed a few minutes later. But we keep observing here how the tank drives there, and now we actually see it, how a kamikaze drone strikes directly into the tank that has only just arrived. And precisely at this very moment, there we can observe it. So there's a minor explosion. The tank continues to move forward. It drops off the infantry once more. We can see Ukraine's impacts scattered all around. Has just completed its mission and is heading back the other way, picks up the next soldiers and drops them off again. And this relatively simple strategy of the Russians at a point where the Ukrainians are not particularly well defended, where they don't have many kamikaze drones, where they haven't laid minefields, because they have only been defending west of Selidova for a few days, which unfortunately works relatively well and allows the Russian army to manage it. We can observe it in these two videos, one from Korachovy and the other from Selidova, depicting the next drone strike, which also did not destroy the vehicle. It works so well that the Russian army advances sometimes 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers per day, gaining more and more ground. Now this mission here is completed and the Russians are retreating to their own territory, heading back to Vishneva. We'll look at the map in a moment to see what they captured a few weeks ago and are now relatively secure from Ukrainian attacks. Let's take a quick look at the map as mentioned and see why it's so crucial what the Russians are doing in this region. Selidova taken over a few days ago, and what we have just seen originates exactly from this particular region. That means they are pushing further there. There's this railway line here that they're trying to follow all the way to Pokrovsk. And there's another one here. Advancement is difficult because the Ukrainians, like in Kurakova, very effectively defend the frontal front and as they are unable to defend the flanks effectively, especially since they're in retreat. We're taking a look at another city in the region, and that's Ukrainsk. You can see it down here as well. It's Ukrainsk, a city that was captured by the Russian army about 4 weeks ago. Now let's take a more extended look at what's left to understand what life currently, so to speak, looks like in that area. These recordings from the Russian army show the former 10,000 inhabitants town of Ukrainsk, where no one lives anymore. It's simply not possible. Yes, also to live. And we see the current situation there. Winter is just setting in Ukraine. In Kharkiv, it has snowed recently, just a little further up to the north. It's clear to us that the Ukrainian population is unable now to properly focus on winter preparations and their basic survival needs. Most have fled anyway, about 90–95%. And the few who still live there are now dealing with the fact that they don't have gas or electricity. And that's what Russia calls liberation, with what they're doing in eastern Ukraine. We'd like to take a look at another video which is quite significantly attention-grabbing because of the weapon system employed here. According to Ukrainian reports, we are dealing with what's referred to as a Switchblade 600 in this instance. This is an American kamikaze drone, specifically a military one and not a civilian model, so to speak, like the ones we saw earlier. Small quadcopters modified, yet a military type. And the interesting thing about it is that already in 2022, the USA, or rather a US company with the permission of the US Congress, said, we are sending these drones to Ukraine, but they haven't really arrived until today and haven't really been seen either. This has allowed for a great deal of speculation that these drones were not in the actually claimed condition at that time, and they still remain in that state today. That the company which sells these extremely expensive and technically advanced drones didn't actually have such a superior product, but rather these modified, say, MediaMarkt, Saturn, or whatever drones that Ukraine uses, which only cost 500 euros. These drones here cost 10 times as much, implying they are much better suited. Nonetheless, we have here a new video that shows how a Switchblade 600 is deployed against a Russian drone crew that's currently preparing a drone, a Sala surveillance drone. And we can see the impact here, but we also see that a lot of excess smoke is caused by this. Thermal view shows lots of fire, but the majority of the Russian soldiers who were stationed or positioned there, and that's approximately 10 in number, they all decide to run away. That means these drones, one might say, are finally being used from Ukraine's perspective over 2 years after they were announced. Does not seem to inflict as much damage as the US company had originally asserted back then. And I still remember in 2022 there was a lot of hope placed on those American kamikaze drones. Meanwhile, it is 2 years later, and we have witnessed the experience of the Ukrainians that the small drones, which are self-assembled and donated from Germany, for example, that they are significantly more effective and also much more advanced by now due to the software that has been installed there by the Ukrainian soldiers and other engineers than those drones which originate from military production. At present, all that Ukraine can do is hope that these donations for small, agile drones continue, that the steady flow or additional supply of these small, tactical kamikaze drones does not cease, but rather remains consistent, because there is still far too little artillery ammunition, and Ukraine is very reliant on these small quadcopters, also from Germany.